Every gardener knows the heartbreak of losing a favorite variety when it's discontinued. But we've witnessed something far more devastating over the past century. Take apples alone. North America once boasted close to 17,000 varieties, yet fewer than 5,000 of those original heirloom breeds exist today. Industrial agriculture prioritized uniformity over diversity, creating a systematic genetic erosion across our food system. However, scattered across America, Depression-era seed collections survived this widespread loss. Families like the farmers in South Carolina preserved Koch's prolific corn since the 1930s, while George Studebaker maintained Sierra Beauty apples since 1906. These aren't just old seeds. They're a resistance movement against the forces that homogenized our food system, and they're fighting back one garden at a time. But what drove these farmers to risk so much to preserve varieties that the world seemed determined to forget? The answer lies in understanding what these preservation efforts actually represented. Families across America were quietly building genetic arsenals, each seed packet a deliberate act of resistance against an uncertain future. Take the farmer's family in South Carolina, who preserved Koch's prolific corn as a memorial to their beloved patriarch, who had grown it since the 1930s but died unexpectedly in 1945. This wasn't sentiment driving their decision. This corn could produce as many as 5 ears per stalk, while typical varieties bore just 1 ear. These Depression-era collectors grasped a fundamental principle that today's seed industry prefers we forget. Diversity equals survival. While modern agriculture streamlines production with identical plants that ripen simultaneously and ship efficiently, families like Anne Marie Allen maintained Depression-era gardens filled with varieties that thrived under different conditions. Her collection included Good King Henry and Danish ballhead cabbage that could be kept in cold storage for up to 8 months, providing food security that extended far beyond harvest season. Each preserved variety represented countless seasons of farmers choosing the best plants for seed, gradually refining characteristics that helped crops survive local challenges. Consider the journey of Beaver Dam peppers, which came to Wisconsin 2 years before World War I, when Joe Huxley left the Austro-Hungarian Empire carrying several seeds. These peppers adapted to their new environment through decades of careful selection, developing traits that no laboratory could replicate. The genetic treasures carried traits that took generations to develop through careful selection and natural adaptation. Sierra Beauty apples, maintained by families like the Studebakers since 1906, offer buttery notes and an aroma strangely reminiscent of pineapples. These complex flavor profiles developed through natural selection in specific microclimates, creating sensory experiences that modern breeding programs abandoned for shipping durability and uniform appearance. Modern hybrids deliberately eliminate this genetic continuity. Engineered to be sterile, they force farmers to purchase new seeds every season rather than saving their own. The hybrid vigor that produces impressive first-generation yields disappears in subsequent generations, creating permanent dependence on seed companies. The families preserving heirloom varieties were maintaining something increasingly rare: reproductive freedom for plants and the farmers who grow them. During the Great Depression, this preservation wasn't merely a hobby, but a critical survival strategy. As one grandmother recalled, "We made it through Hoover's time because we had a garden, because we had a cow and our chickens." Gardens provided essential food security when economic systems failed, and the varieties that survived this period proved their worth under the harshest conditions. These seeds carried genetic memories that no laboratory could replicate. They remembered the specific soil conditions of their region, the typical weather patterns, the local diseases they had learned to resist. Each variety had adapted to its environment through countless growing seasons, developing responses to challenges that scientists are only beginning to understand. The way certain plants adjusted their flowering time to match local pollinator activity, the root structures that formed beneficial relationships with native soil microbes. The collections also preserved varieties that modern agriculture deemed inefficient. Tomatoes that produced fruit over extended periods rather than all at once. Beans that climbed enthusiastically rather than growing in tidy, machine-harvestable bushes. Corn that developed multiple small ears instead of one large uniform cob. These traits made perfect sense for family gardens but conflicted with industrial harvest schedules. The genetic diversity preserved in those carefully wrapped packets represented thousands of years of agricultural evolution. Each variety told the story of human communities that depended on their gardens for survival, choosing plants that reliably produced food under challenging conditions. These seeds embodied the collective wisdom of countless farmers who understood that agricultural resilience comes from diversity, not uniformity. But these preservation efforts would soon face their greatest challenge. The very characteristics that made these varieties valuable to families would make them targets for elimination by forces that viewed genetic diversity not as strength, but as a threat to profit. The transformation began much earlier than most realize. The Plant Patent Act of 1930 marked the beginning of seed corporatization, with U.S. seed policy from the 1930s onward systematically enclosing what had been communal resources for millennia. A handful of companies recognized that heirloom varieties represented a fundamental threat to their emerging business model. Open-pollinated seeds allowed farmers to save and replant year after year, creating self-sufficient agricultural communities that needed minimal external inputs. Hybrid varieties offered a solution to this corporate challenge. These engineered plants produced impressive first-generation yields that attracted farmers seeking higher productivity. But hybrids came with a hidden mechanism of control. The impressive traits disappeared in subsequent generations, making saved seeds unreliable for future planting. Farmers who adopted hybrids found themselves locked into annual purchasing cycles, transforming from independent seed producers into permanent customers. Companies like Monsanto and DuPont accelerated this transformation through aggressive acquisition campaigns. They purchased smaller seed companies that had maintained diverse catalogs of regional varieties for generations. These acquisitions eliminated competition, while simultaneously removing heirloom varieties from commercial availability. Each buyout concentrated more genetic diversity under corporate control, where profit margins determined which varieties survived. The consolidation reached staggering proportions. Today, only 4 agrochemical and seed firms control approximately 62% of global proprietary seed sales. This concentration eliminated thousands of varieties as companies streamlined their offerings. Regional seed companies that had preserved local adaptations for decades disappeared overnight, taking centuries of agricultural heritage with them. Patent laws provided the legal framework that transformed seeds from shared heritage into private property. These regulations made it illegal for farmers to save and replant certain varieties, creating enforceable dependence on corporate suppliers. Seeds that communities had developed and shared freely for millennia became intellectual property owned by multinational corporations. The marketing campaigns accompanying this transformation presented uniformity as agricultural progress. Companies convinced farmers that genetic diversity represented inefficiency and outdated thinking. Modern agriculture needed predictable plants that ripened simultaneously, shipped without damage, and produced consistent yields. Heirloom varieties with their varied ripening times, delicate fruits, and diverse appearances seemed primitive by comparison. Corporate research programs focused on traits that enhanced profitability rather than agricultural resilience. Modern breeding practices prioritized yield, shelf life, and uniformity over flavor and nutritional complexity. They developed tomatoes with thick skins for shipping, corn that grew to uniform heights for mechanical harvesting, and wheat that responded predictably to chemical fertilizers. These improvements came at the expense of the very qualities that made heirloom varieties valuable to families and communities. The consolidation created an agricultural system that functioned like a subscription service. Farmers received high-performing seeds each season, but surrendered their ability to maintain independent breeding programs. This dependence extended beyond seeds to include the fertilizers, pesticides, and equipment designed to work with specific varieties. Corporate agriculture became a complete package that required continuous investment. Regional seed companies had preserved varieties adapted to local growing conditions, soil types, and weather patterns. When these companies disappeared, their genetic libraries vanished with them. Varieties that thrived in specific microclimates, resisted local pests, or produced exceptional flavors in particular regions became commercially extinct. The speed of this genetic enclosure surprised even agricultural researchers. Within decades, the diverse seed catalogs that had sustained American farming for centuries contracted to a narrow selection of corporate varieties. Independent farmers found themselves with fewer choices each year as companies discontinued varieties that generated insufficient profit margins. This consolidation created vulnerability that became apparent during supply disruptions. Farmers who had relied on diverse local seed sources for generations discovered they had become dependent on distant corporate suppliers. Weather events, transportation problems, or corporate decisions could leave entire regions without access to appropriate planting materials. The companies marketed this system as modern efficiency, but it represented a fundamental shift in agricultural power. Farmers who had controlled their own genetic resources for thousands of years became tenants in a system owned by distant corporations. The knowledge of seed selection, breeding, and preservation that had sustained communities began disappearing from rural areas. But corporate control was never absolute. Even as companies systematically eliminated varieties from commercial availability, something remarkable was happening in the shadows. Families across America were quietly building genetic arsenals, maintaining preservation networks that operated with the discretion of speakeasies during Prohibition. Gardeners traded rare varieties through whispered conversations at church gatherings and county fairs. They shared growing knowledge through coded conversations, discussing mysterious varieties with names that outsiders wouldn't recognize. The best genetics often traveled in unmarked envelopes passed between trusted neighbors who understood the value of what they carried. Take the farmer's family in South Carolina, who kept Koch's prolific corn alive as a memorial to their beloved patriarch. After maintaining this variety in secret for decades, a friend of the farmers began selling kernels on Craigslist in 2017, leading to broader distribution. This pattern repeated across the country as families developed elaborate systems for protecting their most precious varieties through brutal winter months. They stored seeds in glass jars buried in root cellars, wrapped packets in oiled cloth and hid them behind loose floorboards, and created detailed maps showing where different varieties were cached throughout their properties. Some Depression-era families maintained multiple hiding spots for their genetic treasures, understanding that a single catastrophe could eliminate years of careful selection. They developed backup systems that modern seed banks would recognize, storing identical varieties in different locations to ensure survival. These precautions reflected hard-won wisdom about the fragility of food security and the irreplaceable nature of locally adapted genetics. The Seed Savers Exchange, founded in 1975, formalized what these Depression-era gardeners had been practicing for decades. This organization recognized that scattered individuals across the country were maintaining genetic libraries in their personal collections, often without realizing the broader significance of their preservation efforts. The exchange created a structured system for documenting and sharing these varieties, while respecting the protective instincts of their guardians. Members developed sophisticated communication strategies to protect their collections from commercial exploitation. They used coded language in newsletters, describing rare varieties without revealing exact locations or the full names of their guardians. A tomato might be listed as large red variety from southwestern region, rather than providing specific details that could lead corporate collectors to the source. This protective language reflected lessons learned from previous generations who had seen valuable varieties disappear once they attracted commercial attention. Seed libraries emerged in communities across America as modern expressions of these underground preservation networks. These institutions function as genetic repositories, where community members can access varieties that corporations abandoned as unprofitable. They democratize access to important crops while providing sources of local income, operating on principles of reciprocity and shared stewardship that mirror the informal exchanges that sustained communities during economic hardship. The libraries maintain the protective ethos of their underground predecessors, while making genetic diversity more accessible. Members contribute seeds from their own collections and take varieties they want to grow, creating circular systems that strengthen rather than deplete the genetic pool. Each transaction reinforces the community bonds that make these networks resilient against external pressures. These informal networks demonstrated remarkable adaptability during the COVID-19 pandemic. when formal seed supply chains faced significant disruptions. While commercial suppliers struggled with lockdowns and increased demand, underground networks adapted through innovative exchange methods. Communities organized porch drop-offs, coordinated mailing efforts, and developed online catalogs that connected seed savers across vast distances. The pandemic revealed the profound redundancy built into these informal systems. When centralized suppliers experienced shortages, decentralized networks continued functioning through direct farmer-to-farmer exchanges and community-based seed libraries. Their resilience stemmed from fundamental design principles that distributed rather than concentrated genetic resources and knowledge. Yet these preservation efforts faced constant challenges. Heirloom varieties often struggled with economic viability because they may not always compete in terms of sheer output compared to high-yielding hybrids. The underground networks had to balance preservation with practical growing needs, maintaining varieties that required more labor and produced less predictable harvests. Modern seed sovereignty movements draw directly from the underground spirit that preserved those Depression-era collections. Contemporary seed savers use social media to connect globally while maintaining the protective discretion that characterized earlier networks. They understand that genetic diversity represents both agricultural resource and political resistance against corporate control of food systems. These networks prove that distributed preservation efforts can outlast corporate consolidation and supply chain disruptions. The same underground spirit that motivated farmers to hide seeds in attics during the Depression continues driving modern communities to maintain genetic independence. But the varieties they risked so much to preserve possessed extraordinary characteristics that industrial agriculture systematically eliminated. Consider the genetic treasures that corporate agriculture systematically discarded. Each variety developed through centuries of natural selection possessed adaptations that took generations to perfect, yet industrial breeding programs abandoned these traits for shipping durability and uniform appearance. Modern agriculture prioritized tomatoes that could travel thousands of miles without bruising, corn that ripened simultaneously for mechanical harvesting, and wheat that responded predictably to chemical fertilizers. These improvements came at the expense of the genetic diversity that allowed plants to adapt to local conditions and weather extremes. Take Beaver Dam peppers, which offer a subtle, zesty heat that represents the best of a sweet pepper with some elements of spice. These varieties develop distinct characteristics through decades of selection, creating flavor profiles that modern commercial varieties cannot match. Sierra Beauty apples demonstrate this complexity with their crisp texture, buttery notes, and an aroma strangely reminiscent of pineapples. Cox's prolific corn possessed what growers described as flinty wholesomeness, so light, so buttery, so quick to disappear that families treasured every kernel. Heritage wheat varieties possessed root systems that extended far deeper into the soil than their modern counterparts. These extensive networks allowed plants to access groundwater during drought conditions, eliminating the need for constant irrigation that industrial wheat requires. The deep roots also created channels that improved soil structure and water infiltration, benefiting subsequent crops planted in the same fields. Many heirloom varieties carried natural pest resistance developed through generations of exposure to local insects and diseases. Plants that survived repeated attacks gradually developed chemical compounds that deterred specific pests or strengthened their cellular defenses against fungal infections. This built-in protection eliminated the need for chemical pesticides while maintaining healthy yields, creating sustainable growing systems that required minimal external inputs. Heirloom varieties are celebrated for their superior flavor and nutritional value compared to modern hybrids bred primarily for yield and shelf life. Many heritage vegetables contained higher concentrations of vitamins, minerals, and beneficial compounds that contributed to human health. Purple carrots contained anthocyanins with antioxidant properties. Ancient grains provided complete amino acid profiles and higher protein content than their modern relatives. Yet these varieties faced genuine challenges that explain why industrial agriculture moved away from them. Heirloom varieties are often less resistant to diseases and pests, lower in yield, and slower to harvest than their hybrid or GMO counterparts. Their diverse characteristics made them unsuitable for mechanized farming operations that required predictable timing and uniform plant heights. Climate change now forces farmers to rediscover these abandoned traits, as extreme weather makes industrial varieties increasingly vulnerable. The genetic uniformity that enabled efficient large-scale production creates catastrophic risk when environmental conditions shift beyond the narrow parameters that modern varieties require. Droughts, floods, temperature extremes, and emerging diseases can devastate entire regions planted with identical crops. The deep genetic diversity preserved in heirloom collections provides solutions for these modern challenges. Varieties adapted to specific regional conditions offer templates for developing crops that can thrive under changing environmental pressures. Their genetic memories contain responses to weather patterns, soil conditions, and pest pressures that scientists are only beginning to understand and appreciate. Farmers experimenting with heritage varieties discover that their diverse characteristics often outperform industrial crops under stressful conditions. Heat-tolerant varieties maintain productivity during temperature spikes that cause modern hybrids to wilt and fail. Cold-hardy types extend growing seasons and survive unexpected frosts that destroy uniform plantings. The genetic diversity that corporations called inefficient proves to be the key to agricultural survival in an unstable climate. Each heirloom variety represents a unique solution set developed through centuries of natural selection and human observation. Their seemingly outdated traits become invaluable assets when environmental conditions exceed the narrow tolerances of industrial agriculture. These forgotten genetic treasures offer resilience that no laboratory can replicate. They embody the collective wisdom of countless farmers who understood that survival depends on diversity, not uniformity. As environmental challenges intensify, the same underground networks that preserved these varieties through decades of corporate consolidation are emerging from the shadows to challenge the system that nearly destroyed them. Today's seed sovereignty movement employs the same preservation tactics that saved those Depression-era collections, now scaled into a global challenge against corporate agricultural control. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed profound vulnerabilities in centralized seed supply chains, while demonstrating the remarkable resilience of informal networks that had quietly maintained genetic diversity for decades. When lockdowns disrupted formal seed distribution systems, the impact was staggering. Research revealed that 52% of growers sampled reported having some difficulty accessing seed during the spring of 2020. Commercial suppliers struggled with widespread shortages and order cancellations, while non-commercial growers were significantly more likely to be unable to place seed orders and wait a long time for orders compared to commercial growers. Companies prioritized their largest customers, leaving home gardeners and small farmers scrambling for planting materials. The surge in pandemic gardening demand overwhelmed supply chains already strained by corporate consolidation and reduced variety availability. Meanwhile, informal seed systems showed a greater ability to adapt through innovative exchange methods that kept genetic resources flowing. Communities organized porch drop-offs, coordinated mailing efforts, and developed online catalogs that connected seed savers across vast distances. These grassroots networks proved more agile than corporate systems because they operated through direct relationships rather than centralized distribution. As climate change intensifies, the genetic diversity that corporations nearly eliminated becomes humanity's most valuable agricultural resource. Extreme weather events repeatedly demonstrate the vulnerability of genetic uniformity. True, while heirloom varieties offer solutions through traits developed over centuries of natural selection and careful breeding. Seed libraries now operate in hundreds of communities across America, functioning as genetic banks that preserve local adaptations corporations abandoned as unprofitable. These libraries operate on principles of reciprocity and shared stewardship, creating circular systems where community members contribute varieties from their own collections while accessing genetics they want to grow. The libraries democratize genetic diversity while maintaining protective instincts inherited from earlier underground networks. Members understand they serve as guardians of irreplaceable genetic resources, carefully documenting varieties and sharing growing knowledge that helps ensure successful cultivation by future generations. Open-source seed initiatives represent a sophisticated evolution evolution of traditional preservation methods. These programs develop new varieties using time-tested breeding techniques, then release them into the public domain to prevent corporate capture. This approach creates permanent genetic commons that no company can monopolize or eliminate through business decisions. Organizations throughout the seed industry have embraced the Safe Seed Pledge, refusing to sell genetically modified varieties while actively supporting genetic diversity. This commitment now has more than 300 signatories across private and civil sectors, signaling growing resistance within the formal seed sector against corporate consolidation and genetic uniformity. Young farmers drive much of this heirloom revival, rediscovering that diverse crops often prove more resilient and profitable than industrial monocultures. These new agricultural entrepreneurs appreciate the superior flavors, unique characteristics, and local adaptations that heirloom varieties offer, creating market demand that supports preservation efforts. Their success demonstrates that genetic diversity provides economic advantages beyond environmental resilience. Heirloom varieties command premium prices from consumers seeking authentic flavors and unique culinary experiences unavailable from mass-produced alternatives. Farmers who grow diverse crops also reduce their vulnerability to market fluctuations that can devastate operations dependent on single varieties. Social media platforms connect modern seed savers globally, creating networks that share rare varieties and growing knowledge faster than previous generations could have imagined. These digital connections facilitate seed swaps, collaborative breeding projects, and information exchanges that strengthen preservation efforts across geographic boundaries. Online communities preserve the protective discretion that characterized earlier underground networks while expanding their reach exponentially. Seed savers use coded language and private groups to share sensitive information about rare varieties, maintaining security practices developed through decades of informal preservation work. The same spirit of resistance that motivated Depression-era farmers to preserve seeds through economic hardship now builds a global movement for seed freedom. Contemporary seed savers understand they participate in agricultural rebellion against corporate control, maintaining genetic independence through community-based preservation networks that proved their worth during recent supply chain disruptions. This movement transforms individual preservation efforts into collective action that challenges corporate dominance over our food system. The battle between biodiversity and standardization isn't happening in distant boardrooms. It unfolds in your own backyard, where every heirloom seed you plant represents a vote against genetic uniformity and corporate control of our food system. These seeds carry the accumulated wisdom of countless farmers who selected plants for resilience, flavor, and adaptation to local conditions. When you choose heirloom varieties over commercial hybrids, you participate in agricultural democracy, supporting diversity over standardization. Your garden becomes a conservation site where genetic treasures either thrive or disappear forever. Each planting decision influences whether the varieties preserved through decades of underground networks continue their resistance against agricultural homogenization or fade into extinction. While corporations continue consolidating seed varieties to maximize profits, individual gardeners hold remarkable power to preserve genetic diversity for future generations. You control which varieties receive the sunlight, water, and care they need to produce seeds for another season. This responsibility transforms every gardener into a genetic steward whose choices ripple through time. Supporting seed libraries, choosing open-pollinated varieties, and learning to save seeds transforms your garden into a living conservation facility. These activities require minimal additional effort, but create profound impact on genetic preservation. Each heirloom variety you grow maintains genetic resources that could prove crucial for adapting to climate change and emerging diseases. These varieties often possess unique genetic traits that can be valuable in adapting to changing climates and resisting emerging pests and diseases. Their diverse characteristics offer solutions to problems that modern agriculture cannot anticipate or address through uniform varieties, as biodiversity remains vital for the long-term health and stability of our food supply. The simple act of saving seeds and sharing them with neighbors recreates the informal networks that sustained communities during the Depression. When centralized suppliers experienced shortages, decentralized networks continued functioning through direct farmer-to-farmer exchanges and community-based seed libraries. Your saved seeds become gifts that multiply genetic diversity throughout your community while strengthening local food security. Modern seed savers discover that heirloom varieties often outperform hybrids in home garden conditions. These varieties developed their characteristics through centuries of adaptation to diverse growing environments rather than laboratory conditions. They frequently show better tolerance for variable weather, soil conditions, and pest pressures that challenge uniform varieties. Heirloom vegetables offer superior flavor profiles that commercial breeding sacrificed for shipping durability and uniform appearance. These varieties often boast unique flavors, colors, and textures, reflecting the specific environments and cultural practices where they originated. Cherokee purple tomatoes provide smoky sweetness that modern varieties cannot match, while glass gem corn creates visual spectacles with translucent kernels in brilliant colors that industrial corn eliminates. Beyond flavor, many heirloom varieties possess nutritional advantages that industrial breeding abandoned. Heritage vegetables often contain higher concentrations of vitamins, minerals, and beneficial compounds that contribute to human health. Purple carrots offer antioxidant properties through their natural pigments, while ancient grains provide complete amino acid profiles missing from modern varieties. Your garden choices influence agricultural markets through demand signals that reach seed companies and plant breeders. When gardeners consistently choose heirloom varieties, they create economic incentives for companies to maintain diverse catalogs. This market pressure counters corporate tendencies to eliminate varieties that generate insufficient profit margins, demonstrating how relying on a narrow range of modern varieties makes our agriculture vulnerable to widespread crop failures. Learning seed-saving techniques connects you directly to the preservation methods that sustained those underground networks during corporate consolidation. These skills provide independence from commercial suppliers while maintaining genetic resources for future seasons. The knowledge of selecting, harvesting, processing, and storing seeds represents agricultural freedom that corporations cannot control. Your garden becomes a testing ground where heirloom varieties demonstrate their value under current growing conditions. This practical experience provides data about which varieties thrive in your specific environment while contributing to broader understanding of genetic adaptation. Your observations become part of the collective knowledge that guides conservation priorities. By choosing diversity over uniformity, you become part of a resistance movement that stretches back to those who preserved seeds through hardship and uncertainty. Your participation connects you to generations of farmers who understood that survival depends on genetic diversity rather than standardization. Each variety you nurture carries forward the legacy of preservation that began in hidden places and continues in gardens across America. The preservation efforts of families like the farmers in South Carolina prove that individual acts of conservation can outlast corporate empires and reshape entire food systems. A single family's decision to maintain Cox's prolific corn as a memorial created genetic resistance that survived nearly a century of agricultural consolidation. The genetic diversity preserved through these dedicated networks represents hope that decentralized seed savers can maintain biodiversity against any system that prioritizes profit over resilience. Supporting heirloom varieties creates economic incentives for companies to maintain diverse catalogs while building a more resilient and flavorful food future. Which heirloom varieties will you help preserve and share? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of botanical resistance.